Hello, I'm glad to be speaking to you via this recording as part of the Christian Essentials series. Today we are kickstarting an exploratory study on the book of Luke. And in today's session we are especially going to look at an introductory view on the book of Luke. What I am holding in my hands is what is called as the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible logically can be separated into two parts. The first part, which takes up about 3/4 of the volume of the book, is what is called the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. It is also known among the Jews as the Tanakh. The second part, which takes up about 1/4 of the volume of the Bible, is what is called as the New Testament. Whereas the Old Testament has records of historical events and revelations and so on from before the time of Jesus, the New Testament has records of the life of Jesus on the face of the earth and records of the early church. There are 27 books in the New Testament. 4 of those books are called the Gospels. One of them is the book of Luke, and that's the book we're going to begin looking at. Now, the term gospel means good news. Now, the 4 books which I earlier called Gospels are among Christians believed to communicate the good news that is available in and through the life of Jesus to the entire mankind. And that's precisely why they are called the Gospels. Now, in this introductory session on the book of Luke, we're going to be looking at a few different areas. Firstly, we're going to see the documentary evidence that backs up for the fact that the book of Luke is an authentic historical book. Now, of course, to someone who browses through the book of Luke, it would immediately be obvious that the book of Luke is a biographical work on the life of Jesus. In other words, the first point that we'd like to address is that there is documentary evidence via the book of Luke for the life of Jesus, who lived on earth in the first century. So that's the first area in this introductory session. The next few questions that we'd address are related to who could potentially be the writer of this specific book, and to whom was it written, for what purpose was it written, around what time was it written, and so on. So that's the kind of the broad kind of areas that we'll be dealing with today, before we dwell into a detailed exploration about the content of the book of Luke. Now, let's begin with the documentary evidence that's available for the book of Luke. Now, what I have here is a printed book, and of course printing machine wasn't invented until about 15 centuries after the life of Jesus on the face of the earth. So when we speak about documentary evidence for the book of Luke and for any other book in the New Testament and also in the Old Testament, we are talking about handwritten manuscripts primarily, because all of these date to prior to the time of printing machines. Now, first century books, New Testament books, handwritten manuscripts. Now, we broadly have the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament categorized into papyrus manuscripts and parchment manuscripts. And there is also a minor category which is vellum. And I say minor purely because vellum is nothing but finer parchment. In other words, you can see vellum and parchment as part of the same category and so on. Now, All of the papyrus manuscripts that we have are simply called papyrus manuscripts, whereas the parchment manuscripts are categorized further into uncial manuscripts and minuscule manuscripts. Now, just to give you a brief introduction about the various the categories. Now, papyrus is a plant-based material. It doesn't last long, or it's harder to maintain for it to last long. A parchment or vellum is an animal skin-based product. Now, that naturally can last a bit longer, much longer perhaps, than a papyrus manuscript. Now, in terms of the text used or the style of writing, the writing itself, when parchment manuscripts were in use, you had both writings in capital letters and writings in small letters. The capital letters are called uncials and the small letters are called minuscules. So that's broadly the kind of categories. As you can see, papyrus, and then later parchments, papyrus initial, which weren't expected to last long. Later came parchments, which were expected to last long, and among them, among the parchment manuscripts, the further categorization of uncials and minuscules. And even among uncials and minuscules, the idea is during the earlier part of the usage of the parchments, the letters which were used were capitals, and that's why you have manuscripts which date earlier to be mostly uncials, and then later manuscripts to be mostly minuscules. In terms of timeline, papyrus manuscripts were roughly in use in regards to the New Testament in the first 10 centuries or so. Parchments and vellum began to be used beginning maybe roughly about the early 3rd century and going up to the point when we began printing books. And like I said earlier, minuscules among parchment manuscripts, minuscules came later to uncials. Now that's the rough idea. Now, in terms of the number of manuscripts that we have 81 Greek New Testament papyri, 266 Greek uncials, 2,754 Greek minuscules, and the numbers I've given are the numbers of manuscripts which have been catalogued. Among these, about 50 have the entire New Testament. Remember I mentioned about the second part, which is really 27 books. The Bible is a book of books. It's not a single book. It's essentially a compilation of many books brought together. Now, 50 of the manuscripts which the number of manuscripts I pointed to have the entire New Testament as one package. Only one of which is uncial. Now, interestingly, as we could expect, we don't have any papyrus manuscript which has all the books of the New Testament, because papyrus plant-based product wasn't expected to last long, and therefore we don't have it. And most of the papyrus manuscripts that we have today are fragmentary. The uncials and the minuscules that we have even the entire New Testament as one package. So we have 50 such one package New Testament, or complete package New Testament, only one of which is uncials. Like I said earlier, uncials predate the minuscules. Now, if I were to give you some names, uncial manuscripts, let's see uncial manuscripts first. Purely because uncials we have almost the entire New Testament as one package. Uncials, Codex Sinaiticus, we have 4th century manuscript which has almost the entire New Testament. Codex Alexandrinus, again almost the entire New Testament barring a few segments, 5th century. Codex Vaticanus, again almost all of New Testament barring a few portions, middle of 4th century. Codex Ephraemi, 5th century. Codex Bezae, 5th or 6th century. Codex Borgianus, 5th century. Codex Washingtonensis, late 4th century, early 5th century. Codex Dublinensis, 5th century, 6th century, and so on. So these are the early uncial manuscripts that we have, most of which, or at least the early prominent ones, we have the entire New Testament as one package. And then this is so right now we have 4th century onward complete New Testament. Now, just to help us increase in a much greater deal, increase in confidence, we have papyrus fragments also. If I were to mention to you a few, we have P75, I am purely now talking about the book of Luke. P75, which is called Papyrus Bodmer 14. P4, these two dating to somewhere between the late 2nd century and early 3rd century. P45, P69, P111, P7, all of these dating to the 3rd century. Now these are the papyrus fragments that we have from the book of Luke. Now, beginning from 4th century, we have almost the complete New Testament in each of the manuscripts, some of which I mentioned earlier, which of course includes the book of Luke. And I have also explicitly mentioned to you the papyrus fragments that we have from the book of Luke from the first 3 centuries. Now that's in terms of the documentary evidence. Now one more thing I need to point out right now is, if you had carefully noted me so far, I was purely talking about Greek manuscripts, Greek. And the reason is, New Testament was originally written down in Greek. For instance, the Gospel of Luke was written down in Greek. It is also true that New Testament was translated into many other languages quite early in the history of the New Testament. Some of the languages are languages like Syriac, Latin, Coptic, Gothic, Armenian, Georgian, Old Slavonic, Ethiopic, Anglo-Saxon, and so on. Now the point is, when you have manuscriptal evidence from the original manuscript, this is the original language, and multiple other languages dating quite early in the history of the document that we are talking about, we are talking about very, very good documentary evidence. Now the documentary evidence that we have for the New Testament especially is unrivaled among all literary archaeological artifacts, unrivaled. So that's the list I've given you so far. Now, so we are talking about thousands of manuscripts in Greek and in other languages. Now this should give us very high confidence in the content of every book that we read in the New Testament, and especially for us, as we are going to look at the book of Luke, we should also be approaching that with a great level of confidence. So far we have looked at the documentary evidence for the book of Luke, and of course, like I said earlier, there are a few other aspects that we need to touch upon to kind of get a broader view, introductory view on the book of Luke. What we shall be looking at through the remaining portion of this introductory session on the exploration of the book of Luke are questions such as: who wrote the book of Luke? And to whom was it written? To what kind of people would it be useful for? And so on. Now, the first question: who wrote the book of Luke? Of course, I've taken the liberty so far to call this specific book the book of Luke, purely for ease of reference. But now let's actually try and see if there is valid reason to believe that this book was written by Luke indeed. Now what you would see is that in the book of Luke, there is no explicit reference to the fact that it was Luke who wrote the book. And that's precisely why we are even raising this question. who wrote it. And to answer that specific question, let me also point out that there is another book in the New Testament which is called the book of Acts. And it seems like, going by the prologues of these two books, that they were both written by the same person. Now, let me read to you the first few verses from the book of Luke. Now, for those who are not familiar with the idea of verses, essentially, of course, like I said earlier, the Bible is a book of books, and each book is then logically split into many chapters, and each chapter into verses, and this is purely for ease of reference. I am reading to you from the book of Luke, chapter 1, first few verses, and it states, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which are most surely believed among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus." As you can see, the writer hasn't expressly identifies who he is, but then he identifies expressly who the reader was intended to be, and that's a person called Theophilus, who is qualified as most excellent. If I were to read the first verse from the book of Acts, it essentially states, "The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach." Now, interestingly, this is also intended to be read by Theophilus, seemingly the same Theophilus. Now, the point is, in the first verse in the book of Acts, there is a reference to a former account. Now, putting these things together, it seems like Luke or Acts is a sequel to the book of Luke. Now, this is not the only reason we believe Acts is a sequel to the book of Luke. There are other reasons to believe this also, which is some things like both Luke and Acts have a very high quality in terms of the Greek usage, and they are very similar in their style, seemingly pointing to the same writer. Also, the fact that the book of Acts begins exactly where the book of Acts ends. So it seems to have been written to go hand in hand with each other as sequels, with Acts being the sequel to the book of Luke. Now these two. And let me also point out another technical point in regards to manuscripts, which also adds to our current understanding, our current idea that book of Acts is a sequel to the book of Luke. And this is essentially from Bruce Metzger's The Text of the New Testament book. And I'm reading from, this is a third enlarged edition, and I'm reading to you a passage from pages 5 and 6. He goes on to say, "The papyrus roll or scroll was made by gluing together side by side separate sheets of papyrus and then winding the long strip around a stick, thus producing a volume. The length of such a papyrus roll was limited by considerations of convenience in handling the roll. The normal Greek literary roll seldom exceeded 35 feet in length. Ancient authors therefore would divide a long literary work into several books, each of which could be accommodated in one roll. The two longest books in the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, would each have filled an ordinary papyrus roll of 31 or 32 feet in length. Doubtless, this is one of the reasons why Luke Acts was issued in 2 volumes instead of 1. In other words, the style, the content, and some technical details about manuscripts and the prologue all seem to indicate that both of these books were written by the same person. Now, The very reason we even had to explore the book of Acts also in trying to answer the question as to who wrote the book of Luke is because the book of Acts has plenty of information which can give us, which can help us narrow down the writer of these books to a specific person. Now, for instance, the book of Acts clearly points out through its content that the writer of the book of Acts was a traveling companion to the apostle Paul. For instance, if I were to read from Acts chapter 16 verse 10, it says, "Now after he had seen the vision," he being Paul, "immediately we sought to go to Macedonia. We sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them." In other words, it seems like the writer seems to include him as part of the team which was traveling with Paul. This is not the only reference. You have Acts chapter 16 verses 1 to 17 from which this specific verse was taken. And then you have Acts chapter 20 verse 5 to 21 verse 18. Acts chapter 27 verse 1 to 28 verse 16. Having references to the we, including the writer, where the we was a reference to the traveling companions of Apostle Paul. Now, it is also true that actually in the book of Acts, most of the traveling companions have been referred to by their names as if they were third persons. For instance, if I were to read Acts chapter 20 verse 4, it says, "And Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia, also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia." Now, as you can see, Aristarchus, Secundus, Gaius, Timothy, Tychicus, and Trophimus, and so on, all of these prominent members in the traveling company of Paul explicitly mentioned by their names. Now, when we go through all such references, what we would see is there are two prominent members of Paul's company which aren't explicitly mentioned by name, and they are Titus and Luke. Now, in other words, we have narrowed down the writer of the book of Acts and the book of Luke to be one of either Titus or Luke. Now, here is where we also get some help from the tradition. And by tradition, what I mean is, apart from the Bible and apart from the content of the Bible, there are also other sources, writings of Christian leaders and so on, which actually points out to the writer of the third gospel, which we have so far called the book of Luke. And if I may point out to a very important document called the Muratorian Fragment, which essentially lists the books of the New Testament, and it also lists the Gospels in order, and it actually calls the third Gospel as the Gospel which was written by Luke. Now, this is a testimony from the 2nd century that the third Gospel was in fact written by Luke. We have also other church leaders essentially agreeing to this claim in various degrees. You have Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Eusebius, Jerome, and so on in their writings, alluding directly or indirectly for this specific claim. In other words, it seems like there is good reason to believe that the third gospel, which we had so far called the Gospel of Luke, was in fact written by Luke, and therefore is legitimately called the Gospel of Luke. So that's in terms of figuring out who the writer is. Now, let's ask some other questions, like, well, can we get a reasonable idea of who this Luke was? And then further on also ask questions such as who was the book intended for, and so on. Now, who was this Luke? Of course, so far we saw that Luke was a traveling companion for Paul, and Paul and we saw that through the testimony of the writer himself in the book of Acts so far. But we also have Paul's testimony that Luke was a traveling companion to Paul, even through the most difficult of times that Paul had to go through. Now Paul, in writing about a couple of imprisonments that he had to be in because of preaching about Jesus in hostile lands, writing about these imprisonments, Paul actually says that Luke was with him during those times. In other words, during the most difficult of times that Paul was in, Luke was with him. In other words, a trusted companion. And this we see in Colossians chapter 4 verse 14, Philemon verse 24, and 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 11. And these are all writings of Paul to a few different recipients. Now, so that's in terms of Paul attesting for the fact that Luke was his companion, trusted companion. Now what we also see is that Paul also clarifies what the profession of Luke was, because in Colossians chapter 4 verse 14 he says, Luke the beloved physician. So from there we understand that Luke was a physician by profession. Now in terms of ethnicity, there are arguments on whether on claiming that Luke was actually a non-Jew, in other words a Gentile, or that Luke was a Jew. Now for instance, in terms of arguing for the fact that Luke was a non-Jew, Colossians chapter 4 verses 10 to 14, Paul lists a few different people, and when he gives that list, he kind of separates the list into two categories of people. One he calls as of the circumcision, and another seemingly not of the circumcision, and Luke is in the second category. Now the point is, if we think of the circumcision is a reference to Jews, then Luke is clearly categorized as a Gentile or a non-Jew. Now this is an argument that some people make, that actually of the circumcision actually means a Jew, and therefore Luke is not a Jew. Now I am not entirely convinced, purely because there are reasons to believe from going through some other portions of the New Testament, especially the book of Galatians and Acts chapter 15 and so on, that actually the term of the circumcision is not a reference to all of the Jews, but rather a subset of the Jews who insisted on circumcision, which was actually a Jewish practice before the time of Jesus, to be inherited by Christians also. In other words, there were Jews who did not insist on circumcision as something that Christians ought to inherit from the pre-Christian era, and therefore there are Jews who can legitimately be called not of the circumcision, and Paul might have seen Luke as one such person. So in other words, to me this argument isn't watertight. There is another argument which is advanced, which is essentially based on Acts chapter 1 verse 19, where the writer says, and it became known to all those dwelling in Jerusalem, so that field is called in their own language Akeldama, that is field of blood. Now the point here is the expression in their own language. So the writer is referring to a specific language as their own language, where there is actually people who are dwelling in Jerusalem, and the language in which is in question here is actually Aramaic, because Akeldama is an Aramaic term. Now, so some people use this reference to say, you know what, the writer is saying Aramaic is not his language, seemingly is saying Aramaic is not his language, and if we assume Aramaic is something which Jews had adopted as their first language, much like the language Hebrew, then the writer seems to indicate that he is not a Jew. Now, this is perhaps a slightly stronger argument than the previous argument for claiming that Luke was not a Jew, because it seems like Aramaic was in fact adopted by the Jews as a primary language as much as they had Hebrew. Having said that, I'd also like to point out that it is still possible that possibly some Jews who perhaps were living in other parts of the world outside of Israel, who perhaps did not take Aramaic as much as they took Hebrew as their first language. That's a possibility. Now, it is true that going through all of history, it's a tiny possibility, but that's still a possibility. Now, so far we were looking at the ethnicity of Luke, and essentially it seems like Luke is most likely a non-Jew, but there is a tiny possibility that he is also he is a Jew. That's what we have covered so far. Now, in terms of the intended readers for the book of Luke, of course, as we saw earlier from the prologues of the book of Luke and book of Acts, it seems like Theophilus, a specific person, was the original intended reader for these books. Now, but may I point out that the book of Luke begins, the prologue actually says something like this. The writer narrates a few things and then he goes on to say, "It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus." So, having had perfect understanding, to write an orderly account. So, it is true that Theophilus was the original intended reader, but the rigorousness which has gone into this writing of both the book of Acts and the book of Luke, essentially means both in the time after Theophilus and even perhaps during the time of Theophilus and especially today, the book of Luke and the book of Acts could be considered to be points of contact for anyone who wants a very detailed, orderly account of the life of Jesus, because that's what the writer was intending to produce before Theophilus in the first place. So in other words, when we go through the book of Luke, we can expect to find an orderly account written by someone who had perfect understanding of all things. Now, the only point to make here is that it seems like when the writer says an orderly account, he seems to mean mainly chronological order, but also other orders in mind, but mainly chronological order. In other words, if you are looking for a rigorous chronological account of the life of Jesus, the book of Luke is the place to go to as the first resort. Now that's in terms of intended readers. In terms of actually one more point in regards to the intended readers. Like I pointed out earlier through my reference of the term akeldema and so on, there are many other similar references to Aramaic terms, and the writer actually goes on to, in many of these cases, actually goes on to translate these into Greek words or Greek terms. In the case of akeldema, he translates that into field of blood. Of course, that's an English translation, but the original writing was in Greek, Aramaic to Greek. The point is, we have a rough idea of Theophilus also through this, which is essentially that Theophilus is not someone who knew Aramaic, and Aramaic is a language which Jews who were resident in Israel at that time would have known. So Theophilus seems to have been someone who was removed a bit away from the land of Israel, and very likely he wasn't a Jew. Now, we also saw earlier the expression most excellent Theophilus. Now the expression most excellent seems also to indicate that Theophilus was perhaps a person of high standing, most likely in the Roman way of seeing things. Now on top of this, there is also a few other places where where Luke actually clarifies some of the Jewish customs, as if he was clarifying to someone who wasn't a Jew. For instance, Luke chapter 22 verse 1 says, "Feast of the unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover." Similarly, Luke chapter 22 verse 7 says, "Then came the day of the unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed." Now, these references seem to indicate that the reader, namely Theophilus in this case, was essentially someone who wasn't immediately knowledgeable in some of the core Jewish practices. In other words, it seems like this person wasn't a Jew, and that's why these clarifications had to be made. So far we saw the documentary evidence for the book of Luke, the identity of the writer of the book of Luke, the identity of the reader of the original reader of the book of Luke, and also the kinds of readers who can peruse these books these days. And then finally, let's also make a brief remark about the timing of the writing of this book. The book of Luke, historians clearly identify a crucial historical event in the life of Israel in the first century, which was in 70 AD, Jerusalem was burnt by fire. Now this is a very crucial incident for historians and especially Jewish historians. Now for people who were writing things about Jewish history, for them to miss out this crucial event in the first century was an interesting point for historians' note. And Book of Luke has no reference to this incident, and this is one of the prominent reasons for people to date the book of Luke to prior to the time of the burning of Jerusalem, which is in 70 AD. Now, of course, we also saw that the writer was actually a traveling companion to Apostle Paul, who also lived before that time, and therefore, the date which is attributed to the book of Luke and the book of Acts, as a matter of fact, is sometime before 70 AD. Now, this is what we have seen so far is an introductory exploration of the book of Luke as part of Christian Essentials series. I'm glad to have spoken to you, and I earnestly urge you to actually watch some of the upcoming videos where we would be going through the book of Luke chapter by chapter in fair level of detail as part of this series. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.